welcome. My name is Ron Shaiko. I'm the Associate Director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth College. It's my pleasure to introduce Haroon Moghul, who is currently a fellow in Jewish-Muslim relations at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He also has a title at the Center for Global Policy. Prior to that, he was a fellow at the New America Foundation, and way back when, a major feature of the book is he was the head of the Islamic Center at NYU during the 9/11 era. And so it's certainly my pleasure to introduce him here today. And we're just going to have a bit of a conversation, hopefully leaving time for questions from the audience. So I thought we'd begin the discussion with the book that's now for sale outside. So when you leave, please grab a copy. And it was quite a stirring and moving read for me to take on this book. I was left with a couple of things at the end of the book that perhaps we can begin our discussion with, and that's sort of the wrestling and struggling with not only physical and mental illness, but wrestling with faith at the same time. And I think a lot of us are in those positions either or and wrestling with all sorts of things in our lives, and whether faith is meant to be a struggle, or as you come out the other side, perhaps it's really the joy that brings you and holds you together. And so perhaps just sort of giving us the lay of the land of what those struggles were, and can you even extricate the struggle with faith with your other struggles?
Sure. Well, thank you for coming out on a beautiful conclusion to a spring day yesterday. It was like mildly, I'm sure it was really warm here.
Yeah,
it was very, very warm in New York. We celebrated by panicking and researching global warming. So the first thing I'll note is I don't know why the book is orange. I actually grew up in New England. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, and the room that my parents had assigned to me was orange. Like the walls were orange, and the shag carpeting was orange, and the sheet set that my mom had bought me was also orange. So I lived in this just suffused with orangeness. And then the book before this, a novel I wrote that should not have been published, I can be honest, it was absolutely just crap. The cover was orange. And then with this, they asked me, what kind of cover do you want? And I said I want like 1950s sci-fi movie cover. Like I thought that'd be kind of fun and counterintuitive, because you're like, how to be a Muslim, but it looks like The Rocketeer. And instead they sent back a cover that was orange with sand dunes. And I was like, I'm not from a desert. Like the book primarily takes place in New York. And if we're going to go by like ethnic stereotyping, my family is from the Punjab, which is like more like elephants, less camels, less sand dunes, more like forest kind of thing happening. And then they came back, they finally changed it, and it was orange. So I think something about me says scurvy. I don't know what exactly that is, but I'm orange. And that's a roundabout way of not answering your question, which I'm very good at. I'm planning a political career. Because I feel like if you go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, the swing back is going to be like crazy, right? Yeah. So we'll elect like another Muslim president. So always just checking if you're paying attention. Someone in the back looks very concerned. Yeah, so it's an interesting story that it took me a long time to write. And I think it got to this question of religiosity. I grew up in a very traditional Muslim home, where there were kind of two things front and center in our lives. Right? One was Islam, and the other was education. And so I had a very South Asian American immigrant experience where my parents were both doctors. I was expected to be a doctor. I was expected to marry a doctor. If South Asian Muslims ever created a country, everyone would have health care and then starve to death, because there would be no other professions or abilities. And so it was this really interesting kind of track in my life that I think makes me feel at times like I stick out, in the sense that my parents stressed very much the importance of a professional career and educational achievement and very high achievement. It's still a great source of disappointment to them that NYU is not an Ivy. Actually, I went to Columbia for grad school just to make up for it.
Right.
And my dad would call me literally every few days and ask, and I'm not kidding, are you sure Columbia is an Ivy? Like, because like Yale, Harvard, okay, but Columbia, so I was like, and so it was amazing, right? So that one kind of hurt. And then at the same time, I was expected to live a very religious life. And I don't think that I ever saw those two things as incompatible, but a lot of people around me did. As in, I think there was this expectation that if you're highly educated, shall we say, and I know that sounds very presumptuous, but I just mean in the sense that you sit through a lot of classes, and you take religion seriously, that those two things can't go hand in hand. And instead, the book is very much about this sort of sense of, me being stuck with Muslimness, that I processed it on an intellectual level, like I believed it to be true or compelling, and yet I couldn't get myself emotionally, spiritually, kind of, practically invested in being Muslim. And so the title is very much tongue-in-cheek, How to Be a Muslim, like it's more the story of how I was not a Muslim, or how I struggled very much to be a Muslim. But I think the most gratifying email I ever received about the book was actually from a young man in Ontario in Canada who said that he was not a person of faith, he had never believed in God, but he found that the story that was told appealed to him because it resonated with some of the questions he asked himself. Right. And I think that was the goal, is to tell a very human story through a very particular language, but not in a way that would be inaccessible to people who are not orange. That was a joke. I'm not talking about the president.
Right.
Yeah.
When did you reach the point where you felt like the struggle was over and the joy was beginning with your faith? And was it the Dubai? Was that the turning point?
I definitely have this interesting trend in my life that I have spiritual epiphanies in like the last place on earth where anyone else would have a spiritual epiphany. So like I'm in Dubai, which is the Muslim Las Vegas, and then like I found God, right? And then while everyone else was looking at cars that you can't even like find in the United States. And I think, I think the moment for me actually that was the most interesting, because I don't know if I've ever reached a point where I think I reached a point where there was joy as well as struggle, but I think there's always been struggle. I think the moment for me that was most interesting was I was in Medina in Saudi Arabia, which is, it was in August of 1998, wow. 20 years ago, and I remember it was 123 degrees outside, which was a wonderful temperature to kind of, it's like, it was
dry heat though, right?
It doesn't even, at that point it doesn't even matter. It's like the sun is punching you in the face. It's, like sometimes when you open the oven to check on something, that's what it felt like. Opening the door was like opening an oven. And so I was at the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad, and I remember, there was about like 250,000 people behind me who also wanted to pay their respects. So you had about 10 to 15 seconds of like deep reverence before you were literally like stampeded out the door. And I remember having this moment where I sort of realized that if I wasn't Muslim, I would have to let go of this experience. And it was this sudden realization. I think it was the first time in my life, and I was 18, so not that I had had that long of a life, but it was the first time in my life where I had found this connection to something spiritual that was my own. And it was sort of like the way that my parents were religious didn't resonate with me. But something about this emotional connection did resonate with me, and it sort of made me, it wasn't like a yay, I'm Muslim, it was like, damn, I'm still Muslim, right? And it was this sort of, it was this realization that I would probably be spending a good part of the rest of my life trying to reconcile my own struggles with living a certain kind of life with my feeling that I wanted to be connected to that spiritual tradition.
Let's go back to the point where 9/11 happens. You're at the NYU Islamic Center. You're sort of brought out front and center to be the voice. Talk about that experience. And in the book, it sort of comes across as if you felt like you were perpetrating a fraud. What got you through that?
I mean, based on the book, I didn't get through it too well, but
You're here to talk about it.
I am here to talk. The book is basically like a really great lesson in what to do if you fail at everything. You write a book. And then hopefully the book doesn't fail, because at that point, clearly God hates you. So I'm just kidding. If you fail, maybe God loves you. He's pulling you close. Because nothing else is working out. This is like a profound sermon right here. So, when I was at NYU,
get back to that,
I mean, you have Khalil now, so things are, I'm sure, very different here. But when I was at NYU, we, thank God that there was no YouTube back then. Because had anyone recorded like 80% of the sermons that were delivered, we would have all been deported. And then there would be no Muslims, there would be no Donald Trump. So in conclusion, I don't know which one is worse. So, we made this decision when I was, like, if you really love America, you are willing to be deported for the sake of your country. I don't even, this is being told, this is a disaster. So can we start everything over? Joanne, is that okay? Can we erase the tape, They're not even acknowledge, no, that's a no. That's not, at least you're acknowledging me. So, I remember we sat around, it was a group of students, we were, 18, 19, 20 years old, and we said the sermons, the word in Arabic is khatib, the preacher who is coming. We would have people come from outside our community because, you and I had talked about this earlier, spiritual presence on campus varies tremendously. The Hillel was very well funded. It was an independent institution. There was a Newman Center. There was a Center for Catholic Life, and that was, again, independently endowed. And Muslim students, we were kind of just this, it was just a bunch of us with we had no external organization to help us, and we had no internal organization to help us. We were very much making it up as we went along. And we said to ourselves, there's like 15 people in the room, and NYU is this huge university. There's got to be, far more Muslims than the people who are in this room. So why are they not coming? And one of the reasons we identified is that the sermons were awful, right? They were either, wildly misogynistic, chauvinistic, offensive, ridiculous, way over time. I mean, it was an embarrassing experience that literally, it was like a game of Russian roulette. Like literally every preacher you brought in would be dangerous in a different way. And you didn't know, and it was really disheartening. And I'm sure a lot of people who are Muslim it resonates that you felt really dismayed. You're like, how is my tradition, like how can there be no one to represent it? And this is before there were Muslim chaplains. It wasn't really a thing. And so we said amongst ourselves, like, what if we give the sermons? And we said at least, and this was where the fraudulence came in, or the feeling of fraudulence, right? So on the one hand, we have no theological training. We're very young. We don't feel like we have the right to do that. But we also feel like not doing it is a problem. And so we're sort of balancing these two things, and then we just went with it. And I told myself that I would, and this is the funniest part of it all, looking back on it, I would create the kind of Muslim community that I would want to be a part of if I was willing to be honest with myself about who I really was. So I imposed on myself and played along with this kind of hyper-conservatism, right, which wasn't true to who I was at that time. And yet I was busy building a community that would welcome people who were like I really was. So it's like, maybe I can't do it for myself, but I can do it for other kinds of people, right? So like, I don't particularly care where your religiosity is or isn't. I just want you to feel welcome in this space and feel connected to this space. And I was elected president of the Islamic Center after my junior year. That was our Muslim Students Club. And the fourth day of classes in the fall semester was 9/11. And then so I realized I was president of the largest major Muslim community in proximity to Ground Zero. And I was a very shy kid. I hated public speaking. My primary concern was, if I don't go to medical school, how can I ensure I won't die alone? Because this is what happens when you're raised in a Pakistani home, right? If you don't become a doctor, you're pretty sure you're gonna die homeless, and like the family line will end with you. My dad told me that I couldn't get married till I was 35, and I'd finished med school and residency. And by 35, I had not only dropped out of 2 graduate programs, but I was divorced. So in your face, I think. I'm gonna go cry tonight. So I was like, in conclusion, he was right. I don't even know. I'm probably not even answering your question right now. There's an answer in there.
Thrust in that limelight to say you're speaking for Muslims and why.
Yeah,
that was what was thrust upon you.
And it was this feeling, and I'm sure at some level, we all feel this, or especially for a member of some kind of minority, you're expected to answer for everything. So I'm 20 years old, and literally every news outlet from all over the planet is showing up, and they're looking for a Muslim community that can, for some reason, apparently has to address what happened at the Twin Towers, even though obviously we had nothing to do with that, and we were just as much under threat as anyone else, and we felt just as much, I think, horrified and terrified by everything that happened. And then people are asking, Palestine, jihad, Sharia, polygamy, Iraq, Iran, like explain everything. Right. And you're sitting there, and then there's this feeling, and I think this is what gets to the question of the fraudulence or how you get through it, is I felt morally and civically obligated to respond. Like if I know something, it's wrong of me not to share that thing. And the feeling I got, especially in the months that followed, is that certain people were using the attacks in order to further a specific agenda that I thought was bad for America and for the Muslim world and for the planet generally. And so for me to then say, well, I'm not really sure what kind of Muslim I am and I should just opt out, felt even more dangerous than the fraudulence.
Yeah. Another thing that really touched me in the book was you referred to something that your elders had said after the Bosnian Genocide. How much of that is generational in terms of conceptualizing what happened and who was to blame?
So, I think one of the tragedies of growing up Muslim is that for every 5 years there is a new tragedy in the wider Muslim world that you are forced to confront. And so for me, my high school years, that was the years of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. So the genocide in Bosnia, there was a conflict between Kosovo and Serbia, and that was kind of on everyone's mind. And I remember for me it was particularly resonant because, I'll give you a good way of analyzing this. A lot of refugees came in, and churches and synagogues and mosques got together to sponsor refugee families. And I remember at our mosque, there were already Bosnian refugees who'd arrived, and then there were Kosovo refugees who'd come in. And our very well-meaning parents had put them in the room together to introduce them to each other. And they were like, they're not talking, right? And I was like, because they don't speak the same language. And they'd be like, but they're white, right? Which was amazing, right? Because it was like, well, they look the same, so why don't, So there is reverse racism just without power, right? So you couldn't really do much with it, but you could make ridiculous assumptions about people. But that was the thing that was so troubling to me, was that these people they're white, they're European. Many of them, their families have been Muslim for possibly longer than many Pakistani or Indian families, and yet they were being killed for being Muslim, and not even anything to do with their level of religiosity. And I think that was alarming in kind of two ways, because on the one hand it was like, well, if they can't belong, then what future is there for a brown kid, right? Will you ever be accepted at that level? When literally these are the same people as the people who are killing them. And then, from the other side was this feeling that you belong to a community that felt particularly impotent. And so sometimes I heard people in Muslim communities say, well, this is God's way of punishing them. That they're not good Muslims, or they're, and so God is angry with them. And that, for me, was astonishing, because it was sort of like, what does that have to do with a little kid, or and even if God is angry with them, that means a genocide is a moral response for the divine. And then just juxtaposed to that was also this feeling that the most you could do was sort of go in front of City Hall and hold up some signs, and what did that really do for anyone?
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of the state of affairs, you sort of talked about what NYU was like. You do a lot of talking on campuses as well from that point to the present time. What is your feeling about the state of faith on college campuses these days? I mean, is it a growth industry? Is it on decline? Where are we at in terms of people just believing in something beyond themselves and having that guide their lives?
So obviously my particular experience is with Muslim communities, and I see, in some ways when you start off, I think what's interesting is that Islam in America is on the one hand very old, and on the other hand very young, and I'll explain what that means and why that's relevant. So the first Muslims to come here, the first Muslim in New York, at the time it was Dutch, was, and you can't make this up, his name was Anthony. He was half Spanish, half Dutch. He was the son of a pirate. I'm not making this up. And he was very wealthy because his father was a pirate. And then he went to med school. No, I'm just kidding. So he settled in New Amsterdam, and then he would often get in trouble because he would fall asleep during church services because he was not Muslim. He was Muslim, he was not Christian. So, and then eventually they sort of reached this compromise, and he founded Gravesend, Brooklyn, and Coney Island. Because they were like, you're wealthy enough that we want you around, but we've kind of got some issues with your, A, your identity, and B, your tendency to punch people in the face, not making that up either. And so and then there were actually Portuguese Muslims who were part of missions of exploration in Arizona and New Mexico in like the very early 1500s. About 10 to 30% of the slaves that were brought to the Americas were Muslim. They were obviously not allowed to be Muslim. They were forcibly converted out of Islam. And so some people argue that indigenous African and then African-American spiritual tradition was suppressed but never fully erased, and then it comes back up to the surface, and I actually think it's resonant. Yesterday was the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, and so it was the Nation of Islam and people like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali who bring Islam back into the forefront. But even then, it's 50s, 60s when Islam in America becomes sort of institutionally expressed. Right. And so the reason, this is a very long way of answering your question, because I think it's very important, is that on the one hand, I've seen a tendency towards a cultural secularization in many parts of blue America, right, shall we say. Right. But in Muslim communities, it's sort of like we're so new in many ways that from the perspective of where I am, I'm astonished at what Muslim students on college campuses have that we never had. I mean, now, for example, at NYU, there is, the director of the Islamic Center is an imam, and there's actually a Shia Muslim chaplain as well, which itself is remarkable and right, would be almost unheard of in many places. And so for the students, they can literally they can just go to Friday services, and there will be someone to give, they don't have to worry about that, right? It's almost like they can think about other issues closer to their kind of area of expertise or focus. So it's weird, it's like I'm seeing this kind of, parallel secularization and then this gradual emergence of Muslims into the public sphere. The thing I do wonder about that I don't really have an answer to because it's happening right now is that these Muslims are most comfortable in spaces where religion is receding. And yet there's no room for them on the right because the current political right does not really want them. And so how do those two things pan out? Where on the one hand, the places where you're most welcome to be Muslim are also places that are most skeptical of or even hostile to faith. And I don't know how that pans out in the life of a younger Muslim these days. When I was growing up, for example, I grew up in a very Catholic town. Religion was a very normal part of life. I mean, there was a spectrum. There were people who were more conservative, people who were liberal, but it was very normal to talk about faith and for people to go to church and to think about living religious lives. And now it seems that it's far more fraught, and it's harder for people to express that, and they don't even have, in many cases, a language to think about that.
Right. Well, and to some extent, that secularization is, there are sort of co-conspirators in that enterprise. It's both the students, but it's also the institutions. I think here at Dartmouth, we're witnessing, at least in the 17 years that I've been here, a secularization of this campus. The Tucker Foundation, when it was created, had it as its mission social justice with a spirituality component clearly linked to it. What we've done in recent years is bifurcate those, take all of the service side of the ledger, move it over here, put the spiritual side over here, and oh, by the way, we're going to put 80% of the funding over the secular side, and we'll leave 20% for the spiritual side. And as you said, at NYU, and just like here, the Hillels and the Newman centers will thrive on their own because they're self-financed. And so we're leaving ourselves in a position where faith, there's no there. And there's certainly not a whole lot of role models that are giving form and substance to faith on campuses these days either.
Yeah.
I want to sort of tie that in sort of reverse the work that you were doing in Spain, for instance, where you're basically presenting a history that's basically been buried. So in that case, there was a long tradition, and basically if you go to Spain in 2018 and not know, you'd be hard-pressed to figure that out.
Yeah.
So do you find that fulfilling to do those kind of things and to educate a group of people to say, this country isn't what it seems, or at least there was a part of this country that's sort of been buried in its deepest places, and no one really knows about it.
Yeah, so I came up with this thing at the time, since I've already mentioned it. When I was about 29, 30, at the time I was married, and my wife's brother-in-law was an executive at one of the largest Muslim travel agencies in the West. And so their primary business was twofold. One, they took people to Mecca, and then they brought them back, just in case you were wondering, for the Hajj, the pilgrimage. And then I have severe ADD, so there's a great line in Kong Skull Island, which is this brilliant, remarkable achievement of Western civilization. It's a King Kong movie in which they find, the main characters find a guy who's been stranded on this island since World War II, and it's now the 1970s. And he's like, what did I miss? And they're like, we put a man on the moon. And his first response is, they just left him there? And then it was kind of amazing. That has nothing to do with anything. This is a plea for all of you with ADD to embrace yourselves. So there was a question, I know. So I'm getting there somehow. Yeah, Spain, right? So it's circuitous. So he said to me, like, we have a problem financially speaking, is that, and this kind of gets to your previous question as well, as the community matures generationally, the first part of the business, people going on pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, that's fine. But the other part of the business is we would take people back to their homelands to visit family. People go to Morocco or Sudan or what have you, right? Mm-hmm. And that was fading because as people's lives became more and more entrenched here, they had less reason to go back. And so he said, we need a new revenue stream. He's like, do you want to come up with something? And I thought, I had this great idea. Why not get other people to pay me to go on vacation, right? So what I did is I said, what people are looking for is an experience that resonates with their own identity. So we came up with these historical tours where we would take people, primarily doctors since they could afford it. The irony is not lost on me. And we would go to places like Spain and Turkey and Bosnia and explore the history of Islam in the West as a way of saying that we actually have a cultural patrimony and a connection to this part of the world that is far older than we realize. And so part of it was, I think there's this joy in getting to read this history and explore this history and then share this history. And there was also this feeling that, I think one of the greatest challenges of the modern Muslim world is that we don't have institutions that translate our sentiments into reality. So the overwhelming majority of Muslims are, for example, disgusted by what's happening in Syria. And yet they have no mechanism to really do anything. So what you get is that the majority of people feel helpless and apathetic. And then a minority of people are driven into extremism, sometimes because they think that this is a way to solve a problem. And the two feed off of each other, right? The extremism generates apathy, the apathy generates extremism, and there's no middle. And so he said, American Muslims tend to be pretty well-to-do, right? And even if for those who are, why not use their money to accomplish a good? So we talked about Bosnia earlier. Right. I said, why not invite American Muslims to go to Bosnia, spend their money there, create a trade and tourism bridge, learn about the place, develop an emotional connection, and then do some good, right? So to say relief work is important, obviously. Financial assistance is important, but there are ways to create relationships that are more dynamic, and to give people a way of saying, hey, I can actually spend my money and my time and my resources to feel like I'm doing something good for my community, and not feel like the only option is the guy who has to get radicalized online who goes and fights in Syria or something like that. And some of those people, their motivations are malevolent. Some of I think they're deluded into thinking that what they're doing is actually going to help. Right, that they're actually fighting because no one else is fighting for them. So what's happening in Syria, no one's standing up for the people in Syria. I'm going to go do something, right? And so, I think for me that was very much, it grew out of my experience, growing up in the 90s, and it was also this chance to find this history that nobody really talks about or knows about. And Anthony the pirate that I mentioned to you was an example of that. And the way these histories are intertwined is so fascinating, in that the first Jewish community in the Americas, in the United States, was in New Amsterdam. They were Sephardic Jews by way of the Netherlands, and the first Muslim in New Amsterdam was himself by way of the Netherlands. And if you actually explore that history, it's because there was a long connection between North Africa, Spain, and the Netherlands, between Protestants, Jews, and Muslims, who had this common experience of fighting the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. And so most people don't know that history, and you get this kind of silly clash of civilizations narrative.
Right. before we open up for questions, I want to sort of wrap up with this question. Is part of the problem with faith in the 21st century that it's too hard? That we don't have an app for this?
That's a very hard question. And I don't mean that facetiously.
Right. I mean, I think part of it, we're wrestling with that idea that what does it take to be a faithful person? And that involves some degree of commitment, and who's willing to make that these days?
Yeah.
Or do you seek out a quote unquote easier religion that Islam's too hard?
Yeah. I mean, I was actually having this conversation on the drive up from Manchester with his name was Miguel. He was really fun to talk to. We had a good 2-hour conversation and a nice pit stop at Starbucks. Jen, I apologize for being late. Now you know why. I accidentally outed myself. And we were talking about this, and I was talking about when I go speak on campuses, people often bring up Islamophobia, and they ask me about it, and I say these incidences are real, but for me it's a weird question to answer because I think maybe until the last 2 or 3 years, right? Like the anti-Muslim stuff really actually started with the election of Obama, because the idea of a black man as president was so offensive to some people that it like activated and energized this like anti-everything platform, right? Like our nation is being taken away from us, quote unquote. And so it's weird because for me, my parents were both doctors. And so I grew up in a town where I was the only brown kid, I was the only Muslim, there was one Jewish student in my high school, right? And his mom would always ask me every time I came over to find Jeff a good Jewish girl, which was amazing because I don't know why, like I couldn't even get a date with anyone, right? And then like somehow I have access to Jewish women. I don't know exactly how that planned out in her mind, but like nevertheless, incidentally, Jeff is a Buddhist now. So maybe I should have found him the Jewish girl. And so, what was interesting is that but at the same time, because my parents were immigrants and because they were doctors, in many respects, I had a far more privileged life than they could ever have. And so I was very conscious and remain very conscious of the fact that what I am able to do right now with the resources I have is very much a product of this kind of, it doesn't fit into an easy narrative like, oh, minority, therefore disadvantaged, right? It was actually minority creates certain advantages that other students didn't have. And so, this is a very long answer to a very good question. And the reason I'm getting to this is that, again, I didn't become a doctor. I didn't do what my parents expect me to. But to their credit, they never rejected that. They respected it, endorsed it, and supported it. And I did my graduate work. And after 9/11, I was on this trajectory of believing that I should be involved in conversations around Islam in the West. And by the time I was 31, and I talk about this in the book, I was working for a prestigious think tank in DC. I was married, I had a car, I had a nice apartment, I had everything I needed that I thought, these are all markers of sort of, suburban, whatever you want to call it. Like they were markers of socioeconomic achievement, of professional success, of where I thought my life was going to go. And literally a year later, I was divorced, I had lost my job, I had lost my income, my savings, I lost my apartment, I lost the car. I was essentially homeless and actually in such a bad situation that I had to move to Dubai, where my brother lived, because I literally had nothing left. And I was mentally ill and I had no idea how serious it was, and in that year I kind of crashed. And so in the span of 1 year, my entire life fell apart. And I think that was the first moment I actually asked myself, what does it actually mean for me to be Muslim? Because it's very, like, I had basically conflated certain markers of external achievement with religious identity. And when you have the rug pulled out from under you, or I guess in this case the prayer rug, then you actually are forced to confront existential questions that you don't otherwise have to. And what I ultimately don't think there's actually that much of a difference between atheism and monotheism, insofar as these are all answers to the same kinds of questions, right? Like what does it mean to be a human being, right? They're just different answers to the same question. And two, to borrow from Foucault, this idea of a technology of the self, that religion is a way of becoming a certain kind of person. And I had never had religion framed that way to me. It was always like checklist. Right. I was about to say checkpoint, but that's like because I'm Muslim. So I apologize, like too soon. Khalil's like, this is a disaster. Right? Khalil's like rescinding the khutbah invitation. So you have no idea where it's going to go. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, for me it was very much like I had to fail in order to actually confront questions that religion is meant to answer. And I realized I never really understood my religion in a way that did much for me. And so I saw ritual practice as, like I said, a checklist. Do these things and then God will like you. And not you do these things in order to become a certain kind of person. And for me, and maybe this is, I don't know, over the top, but it's sort of like, you realize at a certain point in your life that you will not accomplish many of the things you thought you would. That your body will break down, that you will get old, right? That you will, these are just realities. And I don't think we talk about them. And so we don't give people any resources to confront the fact that, life is limited. And what do you do with that? And that doesn't have to be a theistic answer. And I think that, I don't think it's, and maybe it's that faith is hard
Do those that without faith, what are they missing if that's the case?
I don't know. I think that's a loaded, and I don't mean that in a, but I think it's tough to say missing because I don't know. Because for me, I've never found the idea that there isn't a God plausible for me personally. What I will say is that what we've taken away from people is spaces and vocabularies to ask tough questions. Right? Like we don't, I was talking to Sadhana today. I don't know if she's here. Maybe she's, I'm lost. And I pointed out that I was at a Potbelly, the sandwich shop, a week ago at 7 p.m. and it was empty and they were blasting music. And then today on the Delta flight, I sat down, I closed my eyes and I realized they were playing music. And I was like, why is there always sound? It's as if we have to fill every second of every day with something to distract us from ourselves. And it's like we're afraid of being by ourselves. And that fear, right? Like if, Napoleon said there's 2 p.m. courage, 3 p.m. courage and 3 a.m. courage, right? You can confront the world at 3 p.m., but when you're awake at 3 a.m. and you're asking yourself those questions and you're like, kind of spiraling downwards, right? That we don't have space for that anymore. And I guess I don't know if it's a question of missing, as in, faith provides something that, there are different kinds of traditions and different kinds of answers, but I think the problem is not whether it's the right answer, it's why we don't ask the question. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know if that answered the question.
Not done.
Which is ironic.
Let's open it up for questions. Wait for the mic, if you would.
You can ask anything, like, do you work out? And the answer is no. What happened to your hair?
Yeah.
Read the book. There's a question in the front.
There you go.
Also, I'm the only person brave enough to sit in the front. So I appreciate that.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much. This is quite a scary thought for me. For you personally, I think, was it a personal challenge or a personal tragedy that essentially helped you come to faith? Would you say that for most people, that would be the case? That would be the process from being a non-believer and then transitioning to a believer?
I think that, it's a really good question. I feel like it can go the other way too, right? So for me, it was like, I thought that, I couldn't really extricate religion from professional achievement because those were the two tracks of my life. And when one of them kind of crashed, the other one was kind of like I was wavering and I didn't really know what to do with it. And there was a lot of anger there because it was a sort of, and it's a very presumptuous anger, right? Like, why do I deserve anything, right? Or assume that I deserve anything. I think that really the problem for me was that unfortunately faith made it harder for me to recover from tragedies. So the weird thing is that I got a different kind of faith out of it, but many of the tragedies I ended up in was because of how I understood or was taught religion. So when I was 23, I was diagnosed as bipolar. And my response to that was twofold. This is amazing because you can hold competing ideas in your head. One was that there's no such thing as mental illness. It's all made up. So I don't need to take it seriously. And two, this must be because I'm a bad Muslim. Because mental illness only happens to people that God doesn't like. right? Because it's proof of or evidence of or a consequence of insufficient faith. You know, had I grown up in a different milieu or had a different vocabulary, I might have been able to confront that and say, you know, this is something I need to take seriously, and it's not a judgment on who I am as a person, you know, necessarily, right? It's just a fact of life. It's a reality, and I have to deal with it and take it seriously. And so for me, I think, you know, in some ways, many of the falls and fails I had in my life were because I didn't really have any ability to accept that they could happen. And it was after that trying to make sense of them and pick up the pieces. And I think, and I don't know how much this applies, but I think a lot of times we're fed this narrative of like constant achievement. You know, and so we drive ourselves insane with this sort of like, I have to achieve, I have to achieve, I have to achieve. And maybe that's the Protestant work ethic, or I don't know what it is, right? But then at some point you no longer achieve, and then what do you do? And so for me, that was, I think it's almost interestingly enough, it's in some ways the Islam I had made it harder for me to confront where I actually was. And then the thing that got me out of that was a kind of a different understanding of faith.
Thanks. So
Thank you.
I was on a study abroad this past fall, and I was in the UK, and I interacted a lot with a group of students from Pakistan who are like live there and they go to study in the UK. And so I'm interested in, first of all, like, what is your family? How did your family end up in the US? And also, feeding off of that, why, or have you ever considered going back to Pakistan? And like, why not, or why yes? And also going back to this question of meaning, wouldn't that be a really meaningful and sort of thing to do, especially considering the fact that specialists of your sort of stature and experience is something that countries, generally speaking, and I'm generalizing, in that region of the world could really benefit from in comparison to like the US?
So there's a few questions there. So if I don't answer one of your questions, I apologize, and please remind me. So the first is my family is from Pakistan. My parents came via England. So they did the immigrant trip, in many ways a very common journey. My father became a doctor through the Pakistani army. That provided him English and medical education. And after the '65 war, I think he was deeply disillusioned, and so he emigrated to the United Kingdom. I apologize for anyone here who is British. He felt it was too racist, and so after a few years he left and he came to Brooklyn, and that's where he and my mother did their residencies and became doctors. And then we moved to New England. Well, I wasn't alive then, but they moved to New England, and then I'm a product of New England. And so, I think in many ways, 1965, at the same time as the civil rights movement was happening, the U.S. changed like who we allowed into the country and lifted a lot of the racial barriers that Trump is trying to put back into place. And so, they came and they did well for themselves and that kind of thing. I did actually move back to Pakistan to study, to do language study for my academic work in 2004. And I think that there's probably things I can offer, but I think there's one is I feel like that could be very presumptuous. Like, I'm not Pakistani. I'm ethnically by national origin, my family is Pakistani, and in many ways I am shaped by experience. But it would be weird for me to go to a country I never lived in and wasn't even born in and say, this is what you should be doing, especially as an American, given that my country has done some very terrible things to that part of the world. Do you see what I'm saying? And so it comes across as condescending, or it can. The second reason is, I remember there was a conference called the Muslim Leaders of Tomorrow that took place in Doha, in Qatar, in the Middle East. And they invited 500 Muslim leaders from across the world, from Muslim majority countries and from minority communities. And for some reason I was there. I have no idea why. I think they mixed me up for someone else. And then, which might be true because for the 2 years after that, I always got stopped by the TSA. So that's possible, right? Because I look like I have resting extremist face. So like if I'm not talking, right, then I look like I'm planning something really nefarious. And it's true, and it doesn't help. The facial hair, I know it doesn't help. You know, I acknowledge that. But the reason I have the facial hair is because nobody sits next to me on Amtrak. Like it is empirically verifiable. The train will be packed. Like we're going from like Boston, DC, and someone's like, no, it's fine, I'll stand, right? Because like they don't want to be too close to me. The reason I mention this is that when we all came to this conference, by the end of the first night, and there were a lot of breakout sessions and panels and group discussions. By the end of the first night, the participants from the Muslim majority world and the participants from the West had separated. Not consciously, not intentionally, but because the conversations we were having were not relevant to each other, right? Like if you grow up in a Muslim majority context, the challenges you may have are really different. Like I'll give you an example. Like within our Western group, one of the members of the delegation was the Grand Mufti or head religious authority of Kosovo. And we were having a conversation about how to fight back against racist moves to prevent the construction of houses of worship. And the Grand Mufti was like, I don't understand your problem. Like, if we want to build a mosque, I just sign a piece of paper and we build a mosque, right? Because Kosovo is a Muslim majority country in the West. And then what happened is within that group of Western Muslims, right, the Eastern Europeans separated off because their context was different, and then the Muslims from Anglophone countries broke off. Because the experience of being Muslim in Canada and the UK and in the US is in many ways very different from being Muslim in France or Belgium or Germany. And the reason I say that is this sort of a long answer to your question is I think that I feel like you can add the most value to what you know, right? And so the context I know best, and this became very clear to me in a place like Doha, is the West. And so, and I think given, to your final point, I think given, and we were talking about this earlier, the quality or lack thereof of political conversations here, I do think that there's a lot to be added, in a moment when we have the ability to make very bad decisions given how powerful our country is. And hopefully, if in some small way I can contribute to that, so yeah. Yeah. Also, I learned how to drive on the other side of the road. It was amazing. So that is the highlight of my life. Put that on my tombstone.
You mentioned that your family and your religion were really intertwined, especially growing up. Mm-hmm. To what extent did you feel uncomfortable, and to what extent should young Muslims today feel uncomfortable with kind of going against what your parents or their parents are sort of teaching them? And does that make them less Muslim? Does it make them a different sort of Muslim?
These are hard questions. It's a very good question. I have a very stubborn personality. I'm just being, entirely forthright. So when we decided at NYU that we would give our own sermons, there were a lot of people who, were like, we're going to leave. And I was like, okay, bye, or bye, Felicia. And some of you know what I'm talking about. The rest of you just smiled and laughed because it felt like the right thing to do, because you're all sheep. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But my point being that, for me it was like, this seems like the right thing to do. I'm willing to listen to why you're opposed, but I'm not willing to go back on a decision just because you don't want me to do it. Do you see what I'm saying? And I remember we made a decision that we would carry, you said, look, we have, broadly speaking, there are Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, right? Generally, most Muslims fall within one of those two camps. And we can either reach a point, let's say 30 or 40 years down the road, where there's a Shia Muslim club and a Sunni Muslim club, or we can construct more on the model of a Hillel, an overarching institution that contains space for all these different expressions of Islam. So at NYU, that's why I mentioned, there is an executive director who's a chaplain, but there's a Shia Muslim chaplain, so that, because I don't think everyone, I think that faith traditions have differences, and these differences are valuable, right? Like in the same way that every democracy should have two parties, every religion should have multiple interpretations, right? And so, I think that ultimately, I think people have to figure, in an age that's secularizing, I think people have to figure it out for themselves. Because if it doesn't resonate for you personally, it's not sustainable. There's no background culture that's going to keep you quote unquote Muslim or Jewish or Christian absent your own deep personal investment in that thing. And if that's not something you have or want, then that's absolutely your right, and it is better to be honest with yourself than to pretend, right? And I think that, you know, people have to be willing to make that kind of move to find that thing that resonates with them, with the caveat that I don't think anyone should ever feel like they are sufficient in and of themselves to have authority. There's a difference between saying I want to learn for myself and saying I know all the answers. See what I mean, right? So like, I think it's healthy to have rich religious conversations and rich political conversations, but it's also intelligent. You know, I believe in a democratic religiosity, right? And the way that we developed a culture here that we're now tearing down for reasons I don't understand, you know, there's no way I can master everything, but I recognize that we have institutions that produce expertise, and so I hope that we can do the same thing with the religiosity, right? I don't know if, did that answer your question? Okay. Thank you for the question. It was a good one. Someone should ask me an easy question, like what are you allergic to?
Well, I hope this is an easy question. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And sharing your story. I look forward to reading your book as well.
Thank you, so do I.
My question is, well, hopefully you read it, you've written it, right?
Don't make assumptions.
So my question is, how do you feel about the fact that you're always we are always looked at through the prism of our religion? We don't do that to other people. There's so much more to us than our faith, right? The way we act isn't always because of our faith, right? It could be culture, it could be parents, it could be friends, but yet people always want to look at us and want to talk to us through the prism of faith. Even you being here is indicative of that, right? We invited you, and we always want to talk about your religion as if it's the thing that makes all of you, right? So what do you think about this?
I did a clip on a major fake news network. I won't say which one, but you can probably guess. And I have a good rapport with the anchor on this morning program, and I only get a call from any network when like a Muslim has done something absolutely horrendous, right? That's the only, nobody else calls me otherwise. So you usually have like a 60-second window after your segment till like when you absolutely have to leave the table, right? Like, so you have like a very brief window to say something to the host or, you know, hosts, you know, whatever you want to say, assuming you want to say something. So I was asked to come on to talk about, you know, some suicide bomber decided to, you know, go to hell by blowing himself up. I don't know, whatever, right? So, you know, that was the segment, and I had to give some kind of, you know, remark on it and things. And I said afterwards, I said, look, you know, blank, I'm not going to give his name. I said, you know, I'm really interested in healthcare and infrastructure and energy and science fiction, and like I have all these different things that animate me and get me excited, and I would love to come on to talk about, you know, I mean, I was like, you can even give me like the minority angle on like, you know, I don't know, like Star Wars, right? But like get me out of this box of terrorism and national security. And he looked at me and he's like, yeah, that's probably not going to happen, right? And I was like, okay, at least you're honest, right?
That's right.
And you know, and I'll say this, right? And this comes back to the privilege thing, right? Getting tokenized sucks, but you have like two responses to it. Either you can get angry at it or you can use it to your advantage. And I would say use it to your advantage, right? If, like, I would like to think How to Be a Muslim is a pretty good book, you can be honest.
No.
It's decent, right? But if Hillary Clinton had won the popular vote, which she did, and became president, a lot of people wouldn't buy this book. The reason a lot of people show up is because Muslim right now is like, whether you're like for Muslims or against Muslims, whether you're left or you're right, it's like a hot topic. Everybody wants to talk about it. And so like large numbers of people show up to hear me, not because they know who the hell I am or like particularly want to read a memoir, right? It's because they want to like actually see a Muslim and ask a Muslim questions. So I am able to get published in ways that many other Americans will never be able to get published, because you can, you know, like, yes, they are inviting you in the room because they're tokenizing you, but once you get in the room, you can gradually expand the conversation. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Like, now it's true that I only get invited onto CNN to talk about like when Muslims do bad things, but most people never get invited on CNN. Right? So what am I going to do with that? And I think it's that ability to pivot, like that is so important. And I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice when we focus on the immediate injustice of it and not focus on the opportunity embedded in it. And so I agree with you, it's deeply frustrating. It is profoundly frustrating. But it's also a chance, one of the reasons I called it How to Be a Muslim is because I wanted people to think it was a book about being like a religious book. Sometimes that backfires, so we had to have about 30 police officers at the 9/11 museum because they got so many death threats, because they thought I was going to go proselytize at the 9/11 museum. Because when they saw the title of the book, they were like, oh my God, he's going to convert everyone at the 9/11 museum. I was like, I don't know who would be converted by me, but okay. But nevertheless, like the title attracts attention, and that was purposeful, and kind of grimy, but yeah, sure.
So I kind of resonated with you saying that like your parents always wanted you to be a doctor and they have all these expectations. Well, I'm from a Bengali family, and it's very much like every time I go home for break, my dad and my mom, they ask me, so what are you majoring in? I'm in my second year already, so I'm about to like decide on this. I've already decided on doing studio art, so and design. So every time I tell them this, but then, oh, I thought you were doing political science. I thought you were trying to be a doctor, all this stuff. I'm like, when did this ever happen? So eventually they're going to figure it out, I know. Yeah. And once I declare, they're going to figure it out as well. But when you realized that and they realized, what was their reaction and how did you make that more edible for them?
Yeah, so the tactical version is that my brother, who is even larger than me, and he's much wider and taller, I would just hide behind him. So it was very convenient, and I mean that literally, because he was 6 years older than me, and he actually still is 6 years older than me, which is remarkable, right? It's amazing the consistency over time. He switched out. He was pre-med. He went to Penn, so further shame on me, right? Because I went to NYU, but it's okay, right? He switched out at the end of his junior year from a bio major to a history major, and decided to go pre-law. And he got a lot of flack for it from my dad. But by the time I had reached that point, he was already in law school, and my dad especially seemed like, okay, this is like it's fine, like he'll have a career, he's okay. Because underlying it, ultimately, I think there's actually a lot of love there, right? If you come, as an immigrant to another country, you are concerned that your children pursue a career that gives them stability and security. And my dad would always say, if you're a doctor and you need to leave and go to another country, your career is portable. And I understand that, like he had to leave, in effect, to give us a better life. And so he wants us to have the same security that he was able to provide, right? And so I respected and understood and admired that, because I don't know if I could ever make that kind of sacrifice. Like imagine going to another country, and we can't even imagine it, because when you're an American, you travel to another country as an American, right? So you still carry with you all the privilege and power that accords to the country you come from, right? And the culture you come from, the institutions you come from. To come from a third world country to a first world country is, like, that takes a lot of strength, right? And my mom, on the other hand, she came from, I don't know what the right term is, but like a family of religious scholars, going back a long way. So my grandfather and his father, and going back up, were men of letters, right? So they wrote poetry, they spoke Persian and Arabic, they played musical instruments, they were religious scholars. Before the 20th century, to be a religious Muslim was to be a humanist, right? That we've kind of killed off and lost that tradition. So for her, like, it was like a writing career was a noble thing. What I tell people ultimately is, if you care about your relationship with your parents, then to do what they want you to do when you don't want to do it is going to destroy your relationship with them. Because you will just burn with resentment, and over time come to hate and even hate them, because you will be unhappy with the life that you have been forced into. So it's actually, it's bad for your relationship with them, and then it's also bad for you professionally. Because if you go after something that, and this is what I told my dad, if I go after something I'm not good at, how does that give me job security? Like, you saw how ADD I was. Can you imagine me as a surgeon? It'd be like amazing, right? You'd come out with like the wrong organ and like some other, who knows what the hell would have happened, right? So I hope that answers your question. But it's tough. In the moment, it was not easy. I'm not trying to make it like it was a walk in the park. Like, there was a lot of pressure, but over time, they came around to it. It's just like, everything is time, right? So like, at first, a lot of my friends, their parents are like, you have to marry a Muslim from this village, right? And then when you hit like 28 or 29, they're like, you should marry a Muslim from the province, right? And then, you know, like 34, 35, they're like, just marry a Muslim. And then like 38 or 39, they're like, for the love of God, just get married. And then like 43, they're like, adopt children, we don't care, right? So, but the point being that like a lot of the strictures that people place on are a matter of like that moment. And over time, people will come around and see, you know. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, now I'm getting them to like trust me, and I'm like, inshallah, it'll work out.
Inshallah. That's why just put it on God. It's fine. For those of you who don't know, inshallah is Arabic for I don't have your passport.
Oh.
Yeah. Like when you're at a checkpoint, they're like, where's my passport? They're like, inshallah, it will come back, right? We just answer for like, only God knows where that passport is. Yeah.
On that happy note,
Yeah.
we'll wrap things up.
Thank
you very much.